that we're talking about, just to give you a little bit of context first. So the problem that we are talking about today is one that's probably familiar to most of you in the room. It's the problem of algorithmic bias. This here is a picture of a story that went out in the US around machine bias as it pertains to risk scores in the prison system. And in particular, trying to do risk assessments about who's going to reoffend and kind of predictive policing. This is not just happening in the US, it's happening all over the world. This is just one example. And really what we're getting at here is this issue of identifying bias in algorithms, but at what stage in the pipeline. So if we're looking at bias in models and we're waiting all the way until the end when we're looking at the final result, which is the model, it's actually very costly to go back and regenerate the results for that or retrain the model. In a lot of cases, it actually makes more sense to look at the data that the model is trained on, because a lot of the bias is actually in the data, and the model just ends up pulling up the same bias that's in the data to begin with. So I'm part of a project that was at MIT and Harvard called Assembly. It's a fellowship program, and we were really interested in this particular problem and what we could do to better investigate bias at the data stage as opposed to the model stage to address bias in AI. We talked to a lot of data scientists as part of our work. We wanted to understand what data scientists were doing right now to better understand the data that they were using to train models, and this is what we heard. This is pretty indicative, I think, of the sentiment across the population that we spoke with. This person said, it's a total free-for-all. When there isn't a best practice that translates, it takes some time to discover you might even need one. Meaning that when a data scientist initially discovers or encounters a data set and decides to build a model off of that, he or she is not necessarily looking at that data at that moment and saying, what might be wrong with this data? What kinds of bias or issues might be in the data that my model is going to amplify or just bring up again in its results? We also asked a number of other questions in this survey. For example, for those who are investigating the data before they build a model, how it is that they learned that. And by and large, this is what we saw, is that it's about experience. It's not so much about any kinds of standards that are in place or any kinds of best practices. A lot of people said that they are doing online trainings or that they're looking at YouTube tutorials, which is great. And I think there's a real kind of push in the industry from the data scientists themselves to try to better understand, but there's not a lot of support for these data scientists when they're initially learning. We're not the only ones to be thinking about this, obviously. This is actually from a report on AI that came out of the UK House of Lords last year in April that recommended the creation of tools and systems for auditing and testing training data sets. And so with that in mind, the project that I'm a part of created this framework called the nutrition label, the dataset nutrition label. And the idea here was to provide a way for data scientists in particular to understand what is in the data before they consume the data. And that's the analogy with the nutrition label, like a food nutrition label, right? So before I decide to eat that muffin, I take a look and say, oh, well, that has twice as much fat in it as I should have in a day. Maybe I shouldn't eat that muffin. Why doesn't the same thing exist for data sets? Why doesn't it say, hey, there are these issues that you should know about before you decide to consume this data in whatever way that you're about to consume it? So that's kind of the context for this conversation. These are the types of questions that we were asking ourselves and now would like to also ask folks on the panel. So what information about a data set should be accessible to someone who's building off of that data set? Can this be helpful for other audiences in addition to data scientists, like policymakers and the communities who are affected by the data? What's the best way to present this information? So the label that we have here is just one example. I think really we're trying to use this to have a conversation. We're not saying this is the one and only way to do things. And finally, how might we have these cross-industry conversations like the one we're about to have to make sure that we're really talking together before creating any type of a standard that's going to cross all of those different industries. So I'm gonna leave it there and pass it off to our moderator, Sarah Holland, who's from Google and also from Assembly, to take it forward.
Hello, thank you. We are gonna move quickly through the introductions because I think we can all assume that this is an exceedingly accomplished and bright panel that we have. And we really wanted to get into the discussion and really move beyond admiring the problem to figuring out what we can do to develop more practical tools, both like the project, the dataset nutrition label, but also similar ones. But the focus again is going to be on the data part of the AI system. So that's essentially the first question for the panel is there's many ways that you can kind of tackle problems in AI outcomes, but specifically looking at the data, what approach are you and your organization taking in regard to the data? And what are the priorities that you have? What are the things that you have to balance against your constraints? And I think this is going to be a particularly interesting panel to address that, given that we have people from academia, from the European Commission, from standard-setting organizations as well. So please introduce yourselves and your organization, but also give us a little bit of a sense of how you're tackling this. And again, what are the trade-offs and what are your priorities?
No, it's a great pleasure to be on this panel. You see my long name on the slides. I'm a policy developer with a legal background who's in a unit that deals with data policy and innovation. And obviously we're not the only unit in the Commission that looks at data policy and innovation, but when we were created in 2012, we were kind of still at the forefront of data-driven innovation, big data, and the buzzwords of the time. And so here I sit still, and we are looking now at this as, data quality as an emerging problem. It's not meant to be a lame joke, but I came here driving in the car, listening to a radio program on the Belgian public radio, and it was about obesity as a problem in society. So now with nutrition labels, we are probably tackling this on the human nutrition side, but we're also supposed maybe to look at ensuring good quality outcomes in AI decision making. We don't have a standard line on this, and when it first came, I was saying, whoa, this is difficult, no one really knows how to approach it, because the Commission, to be very frank with you, is pretty much observing what's happening in terms of industry. We were limited in our capacity to hear, because people, especially from companies, don't really like to talk to the Commission unless they have a problem they can't solve themselves. So sometimes we're a bit uncertain what actually is happening. So we're setting up projects. There's AlgoAware is a project that colleagues of mine. AlgoAware.eu is a project that looks at basically where's this whole decision making going. We have a platform observatory to monitor behavior of platforms, but we're pretty much still in an evidence gathering phase. But I think the key output to look at these days are the draft guidelines from the high-level group on AI, which was a group of experts that we called for in an open call, composed mostly of academics, industry representatives, but certainly not government officials, with the aim of recommending the Commission from an outside perspective what ethical AI would look like. And if I'm not really wrong, and the deadlines have been shifting, this document is still open for commenting, and I think there's a slide later on where you can find the link or take a picture to find it online. It's pretty easy to find online. But that's a document that we're still consulting on, and surprise, explainability, intelligibility of AI is part of the recommendations. Now, as someone said on another panel, with AI it's a bit like with a human expert. And I'm reading Stephen Hawking's latest book, and from a legal background it's quite challenging. But I think what Stephen Hawking tried to do, being a super expert in theoretical physics, he could explain certain things different from to a person like me and you, different from what he would do when he speaks to his fellows. So the first comment is there is explainability at different levels, and it should be possible. Some people say, well, there's a trade-off. My really smart algorithms, I will never be able to explain the outcomes, and there's a trade-off between the capacity to explain outcomes and the smartness, if you want. And I'm not sure, but I'm putting this here out for debate, for contradiction, or for confirmation. Is there a trade-off between explicability of outcomes and the ingenuity or the smartness of the... Now, from a legal point of view, some people say, yeah, there is a right to an explanation in the GDPR. I think it's Article 21, the prohibition of being subject to an automated decision-making process. And there's a debate among lawyers whether that includes a right, implicitly, includes a right to be given an explanation or not. And I say I don't even care, because it's natural that the evolution will demand for explanation. It will just demand. If you want to be successful, maybe less if you're a government authority and you just force people to do certain things. But if you want to be successful with the product in the market, you have to convince people that the outcomes that this smart thing does for you is actually accurate, it's not really biased, and it produces outcomes that are desirable for yourself and maybe also for society in general. So explainability is a must. It's a sheer must. And I think that's where probably everyone is going these days, to just make it happen. Now, that's a little bit more difficult. And I think the project that we're looking here at as the inception of this discussion is very interesting in this respect. When I first saw it, I was like, whoa, gee, this is complicated, will never work. But the more I think about it, I say that's really what will happen. And it will happen either because the market will just want this, and I'll explain in a second what I mean by the market, or a regulator. And I think the market-based solutions are probably easier because legislation needs enforcement, and that's sometimes complicated. So what I mean by a market-based solution, if it's correct that in an AI situation, 80% of the effort goes to the data cleaning, to ensuring data quality, that cost could be brought down, right? Or the kind of the testing that has to happen before you actually can trust the input data and you have looked at it from all facets, that could just go down. So if we could, in the future, once data marketplaces are more developed and we can, at least for certain more standard AI scenarios, procure annotated high-quality data on the market, that data will come with a label of whatever kind. It just will happen because it's just natural that you want to convince the acquirer of that data set what are the risks associated to using that data. And I think the two elements that a regulator can now play with are either giving incentives to do so, and there's an interesting discussion on data ownership in the larger sense, especially with non-personal data, because for personal data, you will hear it in this conference, this should not exist, and I'm fully on that line. But for non-personal data, you could still contemplate, do you need to protect the investment that someone makes into annotating image data for the smart cars of the near future? How do you protect that? And for those who know the European legal environment a bit better, there's a specific database directive with a specific right called the sui generis right that is designed in the end to do that. It doesn't really fully do it for various reasons that sometimes escape me myself. But we can create, as Michael Mattioli in 2 articles called Disclosing Big Data has suggested, we can actually make a new additional or an existing protection right on databases, data collections, dependent on the publication of rich metadata. In his article, he says that's to facilitate the data discovery, so people can find you actually having interesting data. But if you push it just a little bit further, you could say that metadata has to include the information that we just saw on screen. Now, how would you enforce this? Is that someone like a patent office looking at that you made a good effort in describing your data, that they were not mistaken in the descriptions, or do you do it ex post? So when it comes to court, people find out that you cheated when you filled in the label. That's then to be seen, but that's one thing to play with. So protection rights against the nutrition label. The second thing is obviously liability. I mean, the more people get liable for wrongful AI outcomes because the law wants so, the more people will pay attention to the input data. And that then basically calls for vendors of input data to have some sort of trust mark or certification label that accompanies and says, look, I have a compliant with standard XYZ to fill in the nutrition label, or whatever its name may be, and so be in good hands with me when you take this data from the market. Because there will be, I think that's the implicit message, there will be a lot of standard products out on the market that the smaller players that also want to participate in AI, they will just have to consume, because it's impossible that everyone creates the data itself. So maybe that's sort of maybe a first round, just looking at my notes. So it's either because regulation forces you directly or indirectly to have such a data label, or because the market will basically demand for it anyway. That I think this will come about pretty soon in one form or another. So I'm actually very, very positive about the project. And we will certainly look at it and basically saying, but if it's conceptually possible, then we may as well demand the legislator. Now, what struck me in the process when I looked at the proposal was to say, yeah, look, but I mean, it now all depends on the use case. So there are maybe potentially hundreds of different use cases for the use of a specific data asset. And you, in each use case, the question of bias or of completeness or it's maybe posed differently. So it's impossible up front for all the zillions use cases that are theoretically possible to actually have an upfront description and the risk associated to any of these. But on a second thought, I said, well, then we probably go for the most common ones. And for certain data assets, maybe there's a common set of 3 use cases that are, for which these data would be most commonly used. And then, well, you get there. And then there's the long tail of use cases where you just can't really exclude problems as we just saw it on screen. The final batch of comments is obviously on the sustainability, because this seems to be highly laborious and highly manual for the time being to actually make people, well, fill in the parts of the label, the ones that have collected the data, and forcing them to think about further possible uses of the data. So you created that data asset for this, but now think that people might want it for this. So could you also think this through and write down what the risk associated would be? How do you motivate people to actually do so? That has to do also then with sustainability of the model or adoption, if you want. But I think if my other comments are holding true, that either the market or regulators will want you, so it becomes either a compliance cost or it becomes a reimbursable profit cost, because the data quality at the meta level increases because you have better described data and more people will be willing to buy them. That would be my take on this discussion.
Hi, I'm Ben Zevenbergen, a Dutch lawyer currently working in Princeton with philosophers and computer scientists. Excuse me, I was asked to join this panel in the last minute, and I wasn't quite sure what I had to add to this. So jet-lagged me yesterday, was trying to read everything and figure out what I could add. But I just spoke to Kasia over lunch, and I now realize how interesting this project is and how it connects with the work that I'm doing. So I'll just quickly tell you what I'm doing, and I hope later in the panel that I can articulate what I'm actually trying to think through right now. But so we've set up a project at Princeton called the Princeton Dialogues on AI and Ethics. And this came out of a desire from computer scientists and philosophers to work together. And this is the work that I've been doing for many years. So they employed me over there to set this collaboration up. And we've kind of been trying to figure out what it is that we should be doing. And what it comes down to is a few things. We spotted a few interventions where we think our collaborative thinking can be useful. One of them is the current policy debate. A lot of people are talking about AI and ethics and responsibility and trustworthiness and human welfare and whatnot. But it's always under the label of ethics. It's just and I was talking about this in a panel this morning, so I see a few familiar faces. But just to repeat, that's not ethics. Most of the stuff that's being published about AI and ethics is definitely not ethics, and I also wonder whether it actually falls under the banner of AI, or whether people actually understand what AI means from a technological point of view. It's not a problem if you don't, it's just it's problematic if policy is being based and outsourced even to ethics without really understanding what the technology is and what the reasoning methods are. I can go into a bit more detail about that. let me see. Oh, yeah, so one comparison I just came up with is, you have a lot of these workshops at companies and at governments where we will talk about AI and ethics, but actually it's mostly lawyers and a few other people trying to talk about ethics without realizing what the technology is. And I would compare that to brain surgeons advising the government about psychology. It's close enough. You know some stuff about the other fields, but you're not ethicists, so it's quite problematic. So what we're trying to do at Princeton is really get an understanding of what does it then mean if you're talking about ethics in AI. What we're doing is we're organizing workshops where companies and governments and other organizations that are building AI systems come to Princeton. We go behind closed doors. Sometimes we sign NDAs. And we have an in-depth discussion about a particular case that organization has dealt with. And the participants are the philosophers and the sociologists, lawyers, and computer scientists, the faculty and the postdocs at Princeton, and some undergrads. And we try to have an in-depth discussion, really understand what are the tensions, what are the values, what are the questions that we need to be asking. Can we compare this to something in bioethics, or is it more like medicine ethics, or is this a completely new question? And we write case studies from there, and these case studies are meant for education. So I was having a discussion earlier about the failures in ethics education in computer science. It's often, here's consequentialism, here's deontology, here's a lot of info about it, now go and apply it to your work. And computer scientists are just left confused what the hell that was. So what we're trying to do is build really usable case studies that show you different ways of reasoning, show you how to think about value tensions. Another thing we're doing is soon, probably next month, we'll publish a range of policy white papers where we try to explain, based on our experiences with these case studies, what it actually means to have a discussion on the ethics of artificial intelligence and the different aspects of that. And so how it fits in with this is, I was looking at the label and I wasn't sure who it was communicated for, who it was empowering. But I now understand that these labels empower the data scientists and the developers of these systems to understand actually what's in those data sets as compared maybe to other data sets, more standardized data sets. And with that information, you can have you can have an interrogation of the ethical values and questions that you should be thinking about. I'll think about this a bit more as we're talking about this, but I think this is a really wonderful way of illustrating in a quantitative way to data scientists what these data sets actually entail and what the issues may be that need to be ironed out and discussed and justified even. And ethics are really useful tools for that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I actually have some slides. Yeah, it's here. So my name is Clara Neppel. I'm from IEEE. IEEE is the world's largest organization of technologists. So I'm a computer scientist. So we have more than 400,000 members worldwide, and their expertise range from electrical engineering, which is in our name, IEEE, to blockchain and AI, obviously. So 3 years ago, this question of ethics and AI came up in our membership, and there was a first gathering in The Hague, which after 1 year came up with what was called ethically aligned design. So it was a kind of principle suggestion. Some of them, by the way, it's open, so it's not only our members who can join, anybody can join. Issues and recommendations, some of them directed to the technology community, like ourselves, what should we take into account when designing those systems, and others directed to policymakers. Interestingly, after 1 year we had, so obviously this was a very Western view of what ethics is. So we saw it as a bottom-up movement. People from Asia were interested in that. They translated it and they brought in more than 500 pages of contributions, bringing in also other aspects from Shinto to Ubuntu ethics. So version 2 is, let's say, a more global view of what technologies consider to be important. And now the version 3, it will not be launched in December, but it's actually edition 1. It will be launched in February. It's an edited version. So as I said, the format is suggestion. Actually, it was also taken as an inspiration for the high-level expert group. We also are represented in the high-level expert group on AI. The other thing which came out, sorry, it's very small, is what we call the P7000 working groups. These are standards. So these are standards which should work. So it's not only about discussing, but actually to see what we can do. And we are also a standard setting organization. So we do conferences and so on, but we also do standards, Wi-Fi being one of them. So we looked at what can we come up from what process standards, what processes need to be taken into account in order to take design principles and ethical principles already into account at the design stage. And I highlighted now also other standards which have specifically something to do with data privacy, algorithmic bias, student, child data, but also 7006 is, for instance, an AI agent, which is about algorithmic systems which interact among each other, and where we also have to make sure that these systems know what the terms and conditions are. So a kind of a common language, if you want so. And the other thing which is actually very recent, only launched in October last year, actually in Finland, because Finland is quite leading in this in this space. So this is a certification program. A certification program because what you mentioned, Malte, is actually really happening. So there were people who approached us and said, well, that's fine, but how do we know if actually somebody complies with that standard? So we need some kind of a labeling badge or whatever so that we know that if we acquire a data set or a system, that it complies to certain requirements. And one of that is also on bias, but we also have on transparency. And again, transparency is about defining what transparency is. It is a completely different thing for accident investigator, and another one who, if you want to know, for instance, you have a companion robot for your elderly people, it's a completely different thing. What is a transparency for them, and what is the other who wants to repair it? So actually, so I think my contribution is about what standards can contribute to that. And I think what you just mentioned, somebody mentioned, it's about problems that a company or an organization cannot solve alone. You need others. You need a common language. And data labels might be one. The other one is really on standards. So if it's about certification, having the common basis, and on top of that, you can have other innovation ecosystems. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the data economy. So we are a very old organization. Edison was one of our founding members. So Edison said the value of an idea comes from using it. And that's the same from data. So actually what we will see now is, of course, that you have a whole economy. You have the source of the data, you have aggregated data, and so on. So it's very important that you actually, just as for food, you know where it comes from, but also how it is processed. So again, for instance, in our certification program, we have the city of Vienna, we have the city of Espoo in Finland, we have also ministries. If they want to acquire, for instance, a data set or even a system for allocating housing, city-owned apartments to people, they really want to make sure that this is not biased. So it's about let's say, and also for the industries who provide those systems, it's also a business. It's a risk, I would say. So I think that what you say, that the markets are demanding that, is already here. And the other aspect I'm personally also interested in, so this is the necessity. The other would be to buy premium products. So for instance, if I could have the choice to have a recommendation system for my son, not to have content just as that he likes and his friends like, but also something which develops his personality or is somehow, something where I think reflects my values, probably I would opt for that recommendation system, and I would even pay for it more. So I think that it's also about building these premium products where these labels and standards and certification systems can help.
Thanks. Can you guys see me? Okay, I took one of these invisibility pills, so I just want to make sure I'm not just speaking out of the void here. My name's Jonnie Penn. I'm based at the University of Cambridge, and I'm an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard. I study the history and philosophy of artificial intelligence, so my take on this conversation is, I guess, my aim includes trying to situate this conversation. What is it that we're trying to accomplish in meeting here together? And I'm running a program now at the Center for the Future of Intelligence, trying to build out a history of artificial intelligence so that we have textbooks and things that journalists and policymakers can turn to, because it comes as a surprise to many that we don't actually have these things right now. Most of the histories of AI have been written by former practitioners, so they're very kind of an internalist view of what this field is, as opposed to a more kind of political history about how these sort of technologies change how we see each other and how we organize government and things like that. I want to congratulate, I guess, Sarah and Kasia for putting this together, because I noticed that there was a panel tomorrow on data quality that was just saying data quality is a problem. What should we do? And you guys have taken it so much further. I met these guys at MIT. We worked together there last year, and I've seen how much work, they're really taking this seriously. And so I just wanted to commend you guys for the work you've already done to find a solution in this space and convening events like this. So thank you for having me and for doing that work. I guess, as a historian, the view I have on this kind of challenge that we're facing is threefold in the notes that I was kind of thinking over for today. The first is, I think, to do with metaphor, and only the historian can say this, because I don't need to solve the problems that you guys probably feel like you need to solve tomorrow. But in the long term, I think it's useful to be very clear about which metaphor we're choosing and what the implications of that are. So, if we think about data as nutrition, that ties us to concepts of health, and it allows us to speak about negatives and positives, but it has a lot of kind of built-in kind of an emotional cachet that seems trustworthy, as opposed to thinking about data as kind of a hazardous chemical, and the way that we regulate and the symbols that we use to gesture towards the huge risks involved in shipping, transporting chemicals and things like that. And so I guess at the top we need to think of the rhetoric we use around this problem we're trying to solve, and making sure that we don't fall accidentally into having a framed conversation that we may not, we may not be wanting to have this conversation, we may be wanting to have this conversation, but a lot of that comes down to metaphor. I don't have the solution on metaphor. I think that's why events like this are so worthwhile, to think through what the right metaphor should be. Second challenge, I guess, is once you've chosen the categories, how you change them. So a kind of quick lesson from the history of AI is that when people think of where artificial intelligence came from, they often think of Ada Lovelace or Alan Turing, or these kind of individual geniuses that helped give us this unprecedented technology. And if you go back and revisit the history, actually a lot of it, when we're talking about AI, we're probably talking about machine learning, and we're probably then talking about deep learning, and therefore we're probably really just talking about statistics. And the history of statistics is this, the word statistics shares an etymology with the word state. And basically these suite of technologies, statistical tools, in which I include information technologies, computers, smartphones, etc., have traditionally been tools of control, you know, and they've been funded by largely in the 18th and 19th century, the British government to tabulate census data and things like this. To run a country, you know, you need tools for control to see who's there and whose needs need addressing, etc. But now I think we're grappling with a world in which these tools of control are distributed between states and corporations, and they're increasingly sophisticated. I'm preaching to the choir in this audience, I know, but I guess insofar as we're choosing the way to categorize the kind of quality of data, it brings me back to the metaphor thing, is what is the right metaphor? Because we see with kind of gender pronouns now that we're having to undo assumptions about the past. And as a historian, I have the privilege of looking back into the past and seeing the preferences people were really trying to express by saying, in the Library of Congress, for example, Sophia Noble writes about in her book, how they use the category illegal immigrants as opposed to just immigrants, or sorry, illegal aliens, I think it is, yeah, as opposed to immigrants, to categorize that body of people. And I think, you know, our preferences will be revealed 50 years from now. In the metaphor, our aims and wants will be revealed in the metaphor that we choose. But the reason I'm harping on this is because I think it's really hard to change once you've locked in. So we're in this precious moment right now where it hasn't yet been formalized, and you are the people that will help to formalize it. So not to add yet another thing to your plate, but I guess the positive to take from this to be forward looking is how can we institute infrastructure that allows us to iterate. If the metaphor is not working, we can change. In the same way that young people today are pushing back on being just he or she. We're finding new ways to deal with each other that are fair, and embracing and being open-minded to those changes if they're needed. And the final thing, I guess, is if we do go further with nutrition, I think it's useful to think about surrounding infrastructure. And this could be a whole conversation on its own, and I don't think we have to spend our time talking about it today, but you know, I was thinking about restaurants signifying that they're compliant with hygiene, you know, and the kind of other pieces of this puzzle that would need to fall into place if we're going to go down the road of thinking about this stuff in terms of nutrition and health. And where this leads me is, you know, the field of HR, human relations, was invented. We've created this because we saw a need to kind of, businesses saw a need to to manage their workforce more ethically. And I wonder if to get a full broad scale kind of data classification or data annotation system off the ground of whatever form it takes, whether, you know, what is the labor involved and will the labor be there? Because I see a lot of academics currently being critics to kind of current choices, simultaneous to, you know, academics are finding it hard to get tenured positions. And so just if you think about it just in terms of labor, would there need to be, you know, in the same way that we didn't used to have air traffic controllers, will there need to be a new professional class who manages this difficult task? And the final thing I'll say, I guess, is I totally endorse what these guys are doing in terms of annotation, just so that it's not, I'm not undermining the nutrition. I think what I see in the value of the nutrition thing is that we're annotating our decisions and saying, here are my doubts, which is something sociologists do really well. If they've conducted a piece of research, they'll say, yeah, you know, I'm a white man, I had this much time, I had this much money, so I probably screwed a bunch of things up, but that's where I was working from. Historians don't usually do this, and it's been a problem because we've written about the past with kind of presumed authority, and contemporary historians are looking back and saying, well, yeah, Alan Turing was really important, but so were the 1,000 women that worked for him. But you know, previous historians didn't speak to their biases. So I guess annotation is a step towards recognizing one's own biases, and I totally endorse what you guys are doing with that. Thanks.
Thank you for all those endorsements. We didn't plan that, but we will happily take that. I feel like we have 100 new questions as a result of this conversation, but only 30 minutes. So basically plan to come to similar panels like this for the next 5 or 6 CPDPs. But in the time that we have remaining, I do want to dive in and pick up some of the things that you guys were discussing. And I thought it was particularly interesting, Malte, I liked your optimism about the inevitability of something like this, absent government regulation, that there will be a market-based solution. But I'm curious if the rest of the panel shares that inevitability, that sense of inevitability, if you have optimism around that, or that kind of raises the questions that Jonnie teed up about largely this is defining and reflecting like what society is now as opposed to perhaps what we want society to be. And so how do we take something that is an open source platform where you do want to make it usable and try to get it towards more of a common understanding for like Clara's members, but how do we do that, I think basically with this concept? So do you share this optimism, this inevitability, and how do you square the market-based solution to this given the subjectivity? And Ben, this might be interesting for you too to talk about the different views you're seeing when you bring those workshops together. So this is a free-for-all, but we're going to go rapid fire so we can get in a lot of questions, because I think the audience has Q&A at some point. Yes? No? We can take all the time if you guys don't.
I think that from our point of view, I think that it's both. So I think it should be a top-down and bottom-up approach, and it is happening right now. We have these AI strategies from national states to the EU. So they are, for the moment, only strategies, but everybody's thinking what needs to be regulated. And definitely you also see these bottom-up movements. Also from organizations, you see a lot of ethics boards which come up, internal, external ethics boards. And I think it will only be effective if these two components come together. So that would be my take on it.
I think one way of looking at this is understanding the current phase that we're in as being very much at the beginning of the history of data-driven systems that work, that mediate society at scale. And a lot of the stakeholders are really trying to grapple with what this actually means. And some people know more about it than others. Google, for example, knows much more about how these systems work than your average policymaker, for example. So I said this in this talk earlier, but we're finding ourselves in something of a policy vacuum at the moment, where the policies that we have do not adequately, apparently, mitigate the harms or address the issues that arise from these systems. And it's normal in other fields like genetics, for example, that people then call for ethics. What are the underlying values that we have? And I think with trying to grapple with, okay, if there aren't any clear laws about this, or not about everything, and we're now forced to think about ethics, how do we do that? Currently, the state of thinking is unfortunately checklists. Everyone is calling for ethics checklists. It's a very engineering mindset kind of thing. Like, if we need to be ethical, then give us the top 10 things to do, and we'll do them. We'll optimize for that. That's fine. Like, at least we can just tick the ethical box. That's obviously wrong. That's not what ethics is. That's not going to get you anywhere, or it's not going to get you far. And then the next step is things like these. So these labels. Like, if you can't just tick the equity box by doing the equity model and the thing, like if that doesn't exist, then what? We need to understand the data properly. So I can see these types of labels popping up organically in business. It probably wouldn't necessarily need government. Maybe it's even a good idea to have government, the EU, for example, encourage this, research projects around it, but not steer it necessarily until a moment that actually a particular standard is getting adopted across different industries. That's a good moment for a government to step in and really standardize and optimize that particular system. So yeah, I think this is a good step from the top 10 ethical principles checklist nonsense to really understanding, what are the issues that arise when we use these particular data sets, which tensions can we already see just from analyzing the data.
I think labor is a really interesting lens to look at this or through, because when you look at labor, you start to see some of the kind of implicit preferences. So let's look at the open source community, because you'd mentioned that as a potential analogy. We have a crisis in the open source community now because, it's people are being exploited. you know, it's not that community is no longer working in good faith, because people's contributions are being used by companies, a whole host of companies that aren't paying their fair due. And I think if we recreated those dynamics in this world, that would be a real shame. And the way you can quantify that is just looking at the labor and whether the labor is rewarded or not, which in that community it's not. My solution to this is what I've tentatively described as affirmative access. So I don't subscribe to the idea of data ownership. I think access and control are better words to use. And the reason I talk about affirmative access, which is the word affirmative there is taken from affirmative action in the States, is that we seek to positively redistribute the value of the resources we're managing. Because what I'm worried about is if we just kind of keep going down the current path we're on, if it feels inevitable, for example, that the market will solve this, we're just going to optimize the status quo. And I don't know how things are for you guys, but I don't think the status quo is worth optimizing. I think we need to embrace the politics involved in our present moment. And I think another solution that we can lean on is to think about this resource, data, as something based in human rights law and not in property law. I'm not a lawyer, so I won't presume to speak to this further than just that. But I think the scale of the problems that we are seeking to solve are going to take longer than the near term, and so we have to embrace that. And turning to the elements of human rights law, avoid us recreating the same problems we've seen with the distribution of property. That maybe this will be kind of a privilege of the elite, that they have access to kind of justice in the way that we deal with data about them, and not to the public. Those are just a few thoughts.
It's interesting because it's an artist I didn't know, Will I Am, published a piece in The Economist the other day that basically put in the property word when it came to personal data. I certainly wanted to be heard before saying this should never go together with personal data, but in an industrial context it may, because it's for different reasons, actually maybe a bit beyond this panel. However, I take great comfort from having Antti Poikkola present here in the room, who is the inspirational father of something people call My Data. And I really invite you now to Google My Data, the Nordic model, and read that document, because it was a true source of inspiration for me for actually further involving the personal data economy. And Pernilla is somewhere in the back from Data Ethics Denmark. She knows this movement quite well. So on that front, I feel actually we're making good progress to reorganize the flow of personal data. But I wanted to make a comment on the question, are we, by now having these labels written down as per today, are kind of making current biases that we will revisit in the years to come enshrined? Because today we think, oh, but that's in terms of all sorts of elements taken together, the best way of not discriminating against one, and then we've forgotten something, or new things come up, and we can't. My question is, if the learning in the systems is actually ever going to happen, wouldn't the systems also learn about new ways of looking at bias and discrimination? Shouldn't that be happening? So the nutrition label is basically you require a training data asset on day one, but then the systems is put out there and should learn, and should actually also learn how it actually made mistakes that have an ethical dimension over time, and should be influenceable. And we should actually need to design the learning algorithms in a way that we can influence and feed in new political, religious, ethical, societal dimensions in that learning. Is that naive as a claim?
No, they actually just, they announced this week, I think, or last week, the facial recognition databases, that the systems that IBM and I think Amazon, not Amazon actually, the models they were using were able to recognize underrepresented categories. So it's kind of in that direction, but I worry that techno-determinism in the long term can kind of suffocate action in the short term. So until we know that it works, I think we need to be very cautious, is my view.
I think just to your point about checklist, I think it's not only about checklist. I think if we are doing, really looking about how designing these systems, it's always about looking how it will be used and potential use cases, potential users. And I agree with you, if we are just looking to the data, basically the historical data will just codify the biases of the past. So this is probably not the way forward. I come back. I think the use cases are going to be more and more complicated. If you take the location data that telcos have nowadays, they know where we are, they know where we come from, they know a lot of our profiles. So if you think of that, this personal data. It will be aggregated probably a lot of times, and it can be used to make location-based services, which might be useful. Sometimes you might have a better infrastructure. Sometimes it's used for advertising, which you maybe not so. But the question is, so when I'm up in this chain, how do I know that the origin of the data is first ethical in the sense that it was derived from data which was consent, which it's not personal data which somebody didn't want to share for this use case. And then, so this is the individual data, and then I think the data collection as such has another dimension, because there I want to make sure that everybody's well represented and so on. So I think that we will see as the use cases get more complex, also more solutions and more more discussions and data labels and other solutions on how to exchange. Well, make basically this discussion among individuals and systems possible, so that we have this trust. Because basically it's about trust and also avoiding risk, of course.
Yeah.
I might just throw one quick idea out to the group. The concept of nutrition we invented as well, and the concept of health. We've landed on vocabulary after a long time, and maybe we are limiting ourselves by having to choose an analogy or a metaphor to something else. I mean, the main message I wanted to share today is that we have to stick to our values. Ultimately, because it's very easy to get distracted by kind of tactical, immediate decision making that actually over the long term will distract us from what we're trying to do. An example being, I have a friend in Toronto named Bianca Wiley, who's been a very vocal critic of Sidewalk Labs there, and Bianca says, like, we don't need more data about how to run a city. We know how to run a city, but we're not running a city, in part because the authority of big data is preventing, conversation. And so that's a discussion that could be resolved if they started, ideally just talking about values. And so in relation to this, I think, it's important to codify that big data is not always a solution, and to create systems that allow developers to say, yeah, I think this might help inform the problem we're trying to solve, but maybe it won't. And then sub that, we get into the more difficult territory, as we're discussing about how the data should be annotated to be useful.
I think this is all really interesting, because when we were developing the project, one piece of feedback that we received was, do you want to use this as subjective as possible, or do you want to be an advocacy organization with this? And that was something that the team grappled with and went back and forth, and ultimately we wanted to be as subjective as we possibly could, recognizing that we were all humans and had our own biases. But to make this a very modular prototype, so that people who maybe were an advocacy organization could use that through their lens. And so you could kind of look at this in different ways of hopefully adding in modules where you could determine like the origin of the data, and was it collected ethically, has it gone through de-identification and things like that. So something I think more for us to grapple with, but also will be interesting to see this prototype, because it is open source, to take it and have people use it in different ways for different use cases. Because we talked about the intended audience is data scientists, not all of whom are computer scientists and go through training. Sometimes they're just very self-taught. And we would want people to create these labels as well, as not just the ones who are looking at the data sets, but also releasing the data sets. So if it's a city and they have tree data that they're thinking about, what should go along with that to help educate people about how to make use of the data. getting back to your Edison quote. So I just thought that was very interesting to tee up. But going back, we talked about multiple levels of interpretability, explainability. Transparency means different things to different people. There can be multiple audiences outside of data scientists for this label, right? You could have domain experts. So if it's someone who's training a model in the healthcare field, they may need to also talk to doctors, ethical review boards, things like that. It may be government, it may be policymakers or lawmakers both opening data to ensure that it's opened responsibly, but also perhaps as a check on the responsibility or the acceptable use of the AI system. And it could just be like everyday users as well. So what do you think we do? Is there one way to achieve transparency for all these different audiences or explainability? What do we need to consider with each of those? And perhaps like what are some of the trade-offs in terms of how we present the right information to the right people at the right time?
I've got a worst case example. But I think it's interesting to highlight. So a few years ago when the GDPR started to come to the European Parliament, and I was working in the European Parliament on these issues, Article 39 or whatever it was included a sentence on we promote or we would like to see certification marks and labels and whatever it was that the Commission came up with. Which is obviously an interesting thing to start experimenting with, which is similar to what you're experimenting with here. And what we then saw was a lot of politicians, MEPs, really liking that sentence and taking it on themselves to be, the politician that comes up with a range of logos that would explain to a user, this is what's going to happen with your data. Like a film rating, like age rating or something like that with different colors and arrows if it's going to be reused or something like that. And the idea was mostly based on Creative Commons. I think most of you probably know what Creative Commons is, intellectual property license, where you can sort of give away some of the exclusive rights that you have. And it's kind of based on the idea that there are different levels of things that happen with creative works, and there are different levels of things that happen with personal data. So let's just try and do the same thing. And at some point there was a big study done on this, hundreds of pages of, you know it? And I only dug it up again yesterday. It came across my desk at the time, but I didn't really look into it at the time. And then that was 2013, I think, 2012, 2013. And then suddenly nothing happened anymore. And the reason was that internally in the European Parliament, we were finding that data protection is so different from copyright that you can't just with logos explain to people what's going to happen with your data. You can't say at a data collection point, like, we are going to reuse this for research or whatever other purposes. Or you could make a list of 100 different sectors within which that data is going to be reused, which again makes it useless. So all this experimentation kind of ended with nothing, basically. We don't know, as far as I'm aware at least, nothing came out of these labels that were being created. And that's why I'm so interested in this project, because you're not necessarily targeting the end user, but the sort of the manufacturing process, which is, I think, a much better audience for these kinds of labels to play with and to understand. So yeah, I'll leave it.
I just want to say, you always have to simplify, and that's taking out the complexity of certain things. And I think it will have to happen for various audiences. I'm not a big fan about the icons as they were designed in a way, but we need, if we want to make consent a meaningful thing, people will never fully understand, and they will never fully foresee what's happened to it. It's just sheer impossible, but giving people a certain sense will be necessary to make consent work. So that's how I see it. I still would say that the data quality label, for me, the prime audience I would see is maybe twofold. It's the people in the industry using the data, not the end user. But there's a second crowd, and it's basically auditors. So if you come up later saying AI outcomes need to be maybe inspectable by a class of auditors, not just the whole world, nothing will ever be open, especially the algorithms. But you will have to inform that class of people as well. So, for that purpose, so retrospectively saying where was the mistake, that's certainly a group to look at, I think.
So the discussion we are involved in are what you mentioned about auditing, certainly with certification. And the certification could be for an organization as well, just like ISO 9000, for instance, where you make sure that the groups are at place who are looking at these things, who are looking at so processes and internal groups are there, so that you make sure that the organization as such has this mindset or the philosophy to take certain values into consideration. So that is one of the, and including data, that is one of the possible concrete implementations. The other would be, it's about what I also mentioned about electronic labels. So so algorithmic systems who talk to other systems can recognize that that system satisfies certain requirements. And probably this is going to be also somewhere, we have to implement something like that, because we will have less and less manual consent. We will have more and more systems talking to systems, and this is also something that we can think of, and there are certain things going on blockchain that you basically can see, about the data origin and so on. So these are the discussions which are going on, and let's say more practical point of view.
I might just throw in quickly, something I've been struggling with recently is like the ethics of AI community I've been a part of, on the whole, has been paternalistic, and I don't know how to avoid this problem of we're trying to solve something for everybody, and I consider myself a part of this, that it's their right to solve. And I agree with you about consent, the importance of getting consent, but I just got to speak at Davos last week, which is the weirdest thing, but their theme was mental health, and they talked about mental health, as many people do, as like an individual's responsibility. So if you're depressed, meditate. As opposed to, changing the world so that we can have decent jobs and then have the hope of buying a house one day. Structural change. And I worry here that this is what I kind of mean about getting blinders on. That this is a problem we need to solve, but it's a problem we need to solve within a larger problem, which is like, what are our values? Where do we want to go? And I'm sorry if this is obvious to everybody, but it's something I am having to relearn constantly, that if social justice is an element of what we're doing here, and we can't expect to just offload these responsibilities to the individual because only the elite will have the privilege of having the time or even the interest to solve some of these problems, we need to rethink perhaps the whole structure. I don't have the solutions, I'm sorry, but I think that thinking about human rights and extending them into our digital lives is a good place to start, because if we think about it as inevitable and as consent as atomized, I don't see us moving into any paradigm, any better future than where we're at. I see it as offloading labor from big organizations to the crowd.
Okay, thank you. That was, I think, really interesting. If I can sum up, I think our consensus is don't prioritize the end user, recognize your bias. Don't prioritize the end user, recognize the end user, don't prioritize the end user for this particular project, and continue to work together. And I think, Clara, it's also a special lesson to make sure that this conversation is not just dominated by Western values in US and Europe, which these often are, and to make sure that we are doing everything we can to bring in South and Central America, as well as Asia and other parts. Okay, so we can turn it over to audience Q&A if there are questions from the audience. In the back, you had first, and then you in the front. Oh, microphones are coming.
Is it working? Yeah. I just need to know, is the idea of a European privacy seal totally dead?
What do you mean? The one and only, you mean?
The one we talked about in the wake of GDPR will have a privacy seal.
No, there are.
And they were working with Europrise as well to kind of develop it. Is it dead?
I hear at least about one certification mechanism to operate, which is a Luxembourg system, Europrivacy, but it's not a space I'm following pretty actively. I can find out for you, Penilla.
Do you want it to be dead? Do you want it to be dead? You're so enthusiastic in asking. Okay.
Okay. Next question.
First of all, thank you very much for the superbly interesting panel and the discussion, very diversified opinions. I personally enjoyed it really much. There was a lot of discussion about the data that is inputted into systems, and of course, ideally, we would have mechanisms and systems of ex-ante regulation, looking at qualification labels, looking at standards, which are very important and everything. But there has been an ongoing discussion about the possibility in order to regulate and enforce rules effectively, to audit code for algorithms. To actually, if there is an issue of discrimination or something find out, to actually open up the algorithms of a company or corporation and have an expert look at them, just to have some insight on whether something went wrong in the coding itself. And there's a super big discussion about the intellectual work, intellectual property, and who would be responsible for that, who would have answers to that, and so on and so forth. And I would like to know your positions on that possibility, or anybody who would like to answer.
I'm not sure I fully heard your question, but I think my response would be, well, at least an auditor, which is certified, has professional secret obligation, should be able to look at things. So opening up, yes, but to whom? Maybe in some situations, auditors could be playing a useful role. Is that responding to the question?
Yeah, so in our standard on transparency, as I mentioned, there's one on defining different levels of transparency. One of them would be also accident investigators who would look into what, like a black box, like for air accidents we have this black box. It would be something like that, similar, so that you can actually see what happened, what kind of data was in place, and yes, those auditors and investigators should normally have the right to look into that.
And I'd like to quickly add to that some of the best auditors are actually academics. My colleague Arvind Narayanan at Princeton is running the Web Transparency and Accountability Project, where they build AI systems to interrogate other algorithmic decision-making systems. So it's also important to give access to these systems to academics, to be able to hold the more powerful to account, and for them to write their interesting papers.
Can I just throw one last thing in? I just want to echo your point, Clara, about the American system for flight crashes is an amazing model. They use task forces of like 12 people that will go and investigate an accident, and the companies, all the aviation companies work with them. They've reduced accidents to the point that in 2017 nobody died. This is not what happens in motor vehicle deaths. This is a whole separate thing, but I think that model is worth digging into. I did some work on it, and it's positive. It only exists because a congressman died in 1936 in a plane crash, and so congressman got scared and took this chance. So, yeah.
I think we have about 5 minutes left, so if we can just speed the questions and we'll try to get in as much as we can. I think we had one in the back, and then the front, and then the back again, if I did that right. Is there a hand over here on this side? No? Okay, then yes? I feel like I'm at an auction. Going on to, okay. Highest bidder up here at the front.
Hi, thanks. It was really great panel. I have one point to Jonnie's point about human rights, and as a human rights lawyer, I'm really aware of the benefits of human rights approach, but also there are a lot of limitations. And I'm referring, for example, to the criticisms of Samuel Moyn on human rights approach. And human rights approach is favoring individualistic rights and also rights of those who are already privileged. And almost all the time we are forgetting about social rights. So human rights approach is also not maybe the best solution. I'm just maybe as they're trying to provoke you, do you think there is another type of universal type of values that we can think of, or is there any universal type of values that we can even think of if it's not human rights?
So I was a colleague of mine at the Berkman Klein Center. Her name's Salome Verhun, and she's a privacy scholar, and it's through her that I've come to realize my position on this. I am not a lawyer, so you would know this better than I would, but I think if it's difficult, the point she makes often is that if social justice is the aim, the redistribution or the assertion of rights historically has been a better mechanism to redistribute power than the redistribution of property. 40 acres and a mule didn't happen. Yeah, I would love to dive in more. I think one way to talk about it is how long are we going to allow to solve the problem? Maybe it is a really difficult thing in the short term, but is it over the next 50 years going to bring us closer to a more equitable society than solutions that may solve immediate problems but not add up to?
Still take it, but I think we had one.
Just a super quick plug. On April 12th, we're organizing a conference. Everyone's invited to Princeton with the UN to interrogate how we should reinterpret the access to social human rights through the lens of government use of these technologies. So you're definitely invited, and all of you are also invited.
Yeah, okay, thanks. I just thought I was second to him. My question was about also what we can learn from flight safety. I think you brought that up, Jonnie, which is why I was stunned. So we have all of these elements, maybe certification, we have this very nice idea of the nutrition labels and of audits. And then I think an element that's very present in flight safety is also the public scrutiny, a certain culture to really investigate when something goes wrong, to document a lot of things, and dealing with very complex systems. So you do not only have your own plane, you have weather, you have airports and all sorts of things. So, and this is a very open question, and I ask you, Jonnie, but also Ben, because I think he looked into what we can transfer from other systems, like medical ethics or codes of conduct, and maybe there's also something there. I know it's very hard to generate a culture or something like this, but I think there might be some mechanisms in flight safety that we can hear more concretely about, and where we can embed something like the labels. So that was the question, and then I cannot resist to make one remark about perceiving the analogy with nutrition or hazardous chemicals. Maybe we can unite this by saying, like, if some nutrition is not properly handled, then it turns into hazardous chemicals. So actually we can stay in this metaphor. Yeah, I just wanted to join in the wordplay, but the question is clear, I think.
I think hazardous chemicals and nutrition have in common that they're both normative claims. I think we can avoid that, having to make that decision in the near term, by just dealing with annotation. If we annotated our data, the world would be better. Like, that is, I think, is a great move forward, and you guys are leading it. I think that, to be very brief, some of the things we can learn from the aviation industry's, ecosystem's response to catastrophe is their motto is something akin to anybody's error is everybody's error. And it's the same basic idea that they use on the space station. And the goal is to hold a very high threshold for what we accept. So we will allow 300 people to die in a car accident, in different car accidents, and 300 car accidents. We freak out when 300 people die in a plane. So we have different kind of values of which we'll accept. And I think in this world, if we keep in this moment, in this precious moment, as the infrastructure is solidified, if we keep a very high threshold of what the society we want is, then things, I hope, in the long term will work out. But I think we need to approach it like that. The other plug I'll give is in their task force, when there is an accident, these people are ready within 2 hours or 4 hours notice to fly wherever the accident's been. It's an interdisciplinary team. And I think that one of the pushbacks I've hoped to have given or expressed today is that, part of what we're trying to do here is ethnography. Part of what we're trying to do here is sociology. Part of what we're doing here is combine skill sets. That's why you annotate, right? It's because you're trying to tell data scientists, there's other things to consider here, and that task force approach embodies that really, really well. And I think in government, if anything is possible, then we could start to embody that more.
Yeah, to that sub question, that was for me. So we've had one in these workshops. I'm not sure if I talked about these here. We've been doing workshops at Princeton behind closed doors. One of the presenters came with a case and said that their frame of trying to solve for the ethical issues that arose in this AI system was the knowledge that they'd built up in safety critical system analysis. I'm not sure if that's exactly the term for their methodology. And he wanted to explore with us, taking us through their reasoning, whether that methodology could just be transposed to the evaluation of AI systems. And the conclusion that we kind of came to was that it's definitely very interesting, but there are other methods of evaluation that are closer to AI systems than safety critical evaluations of airplanes, for example. I can't remember exactly what the criteria were in these evaluations. But so what's driving me crazy at the moment is trying to understand how research ethics frameworks and bioethics frameworks, how the sort of the tensions and the rules and the principles from those can be imposed on the evaluation of AI systems, while making sure that you understand that the underlying assumptions are very different. So you have these principles, but these principles arise for certain reasons. And some of those are informational, but now with digital information, everything being connected, linked, shareable, the concept of information has changed to a large extent. So the way that previously we'd been coming up with ethical ways of thinking about dealing with information is now very different. So we're trying to figure out, how can we use these past frameworks that have been really well thought out and translate the underlying assumptions to the assumptions or the facts about information we have today, and then reapply them. It's driving me crazy at the moment, so I don't have any answers. But it's, I think that answers your question.
Are you guys looking at domain-specific solutions then, or like cross-sector?
Both. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think we're out of time, luckily.
I think we are. I haven't heard the bells yet, but I think we're out of time. So thank you. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists. Please continue to check out their work. Look at the Dataset Nutrition Label Project. Please give your feedback. It is a prototype, so we very much want that. And thank you all for your time and joining us today.